Behind carefully maintained smiles and polished public appearances, a former maid has stepped forward with a revealing picture of Prince Andrew that palace public relations could never erase. Her story lifts the velvet curtain on quiet cruelty, hidden routines, and a deep-rooted sense of entitlement that became second nature over the years. In 2010, there certainly wasn't a party celebrating any kind of release in December. Now, the focus turns to piecing together her account and the small but telling moments that expose the larger themes of power and privilege. Private embarrassments, hushed commands, and silent exchanges for protection begin to surface. Prince Andrew has demanded a jury trial and officially denied all allegations as he submitted his response to a New York court concerning accusations of a sexual nature. But the question remains: what happens when the voices of servants rise and the flawless image of the crown begins to fracture? What follows is an unfiltered look at a hidden world. Long before the headlines and controversies, there was another story unfolding quietly within the royal residence. It was whispered among those who worked closely in the daily life of the royals. To the outside world, palace staff appear graceful, loyal, and immaculately composed as they move through grand corridors. Yet reality was far more complex, especially for those working in close proximity to Prince Andrew. They often felt a tension others couldn't sense, and some quietly harbored resentment they were afraid to express. One such person was a man named Paul, Prince Andrew's personal valet, who had served him for many years. Living in an apartment directly connected to Andrew's quarters, Paul handled his clothing, organized his belongings, and responded to his every request. Beneath the formal role and polished environment, however, his personal experience was far more troubling. Those who spoke with him revealed that he deeply despised the position, not because of the workload, but due to Andrew's behavior. The situation was made worse by strange and unreasonable requests. Andrew owned a Jack Russell Terrier named Bendix, a name many found unusual. More unusual still was Andrew's pattern of waking Paul in the middle of the night whenever the dog moved or stirred. At 2 or 3 in the morning, he would push a private buzzer or call a direct line that brought Paul to attention instantly. Still half asleep, Paul would take the dog outside and stand in the freezing darkness, smoking a cigarette just to remain awake. These nighttime interruptions became routine, leaving him physically drained and emotionally resentful. During some of these late hours, when palace security officers were making their rounds through the gardens, they would encounter Paul and hear him vent his frustration. Without hesitation, he expressed his contempt for the prince. His words were laced with anger, the kind that can only build after years of humiliation. He described Andrew as rude, demanding, and habitually cruel, even shocking those accustomed to royal entitlement. At one point, his bitterness became so intense that he jokingly wished Andrew's upcoming skiing trip would end in a tragic accident. This resentment was not limited to one individual. Many insiders believed Andrew had been indulged for far too long. Some even claimed that had Prince Philip stepped in early, perhaps even punishing him harshly the first time he disrespected a servant, life might have turned out differently. Instead, Andrew entered adulthood without clear limits, raised as though he were incapable of wrongdoing. Staff openly speculated that he was the Queen's favorite, shielded from accountability in a world entirely governed by rank. The palace itself did not function like a normal workplace. It resembled a small kingdom of its own. Employees were separated into 3 categories: senior officials who enjoyed fine dining and formal service, mid-level administrative staff, and the lowest-ranking workers such as maids and footmen, who relied on microwaves and kettles. Even in the corridors, everyone moved with silent awareness of their position in this strict hierarchy. Those who began working there at a young age often remained for life. The palace became their entire world, their community, their identity. Loyalty was more than encouraged, it was ingrained. And that loyalty became dangerous. No matter how badly Andrew behaved, no one dared confront him. Not the servants, not the valet, and not even the protection officers assigned to follow him everywhere. They were employees, not companions, and their duty was to guard him, not to question his actions. This reality leads to a darker question, one that insiders only dared to ask in whispers after everything began to unravel. If this was how he acted within the palace walls, what occurred when there were no witnesses? The deeper one looks into the royal system, the more obvious it becomes that power does not merely shape behavior, it conceals it. By the time Andrew had matured, the world around him had been structured to absorb his faults. His mistakes, his cruelty, and his poor judgment were quietly ignored. Rumors circulated, but no one confronted him. This culture of silence would later spark serious doubts about his life beyond palace grounds. Those tasked with protecting him described their role as one of unquestioning duty. They remained invisible, never intervening. To an outsider, it might seem impossible that they were unaware of the details of his private life, but within the system, the truth was clear. A protection officer was never meant to be a confidant, no matter how casual the interaction. They did not enter his private spaces, nor did they inquire about his destinations. Their only responsibility was his safety, not his moral accountability. Still, even from a distance, strange signs stood out. Unusual travel arrangements, questionable companions, sudden changes in his routine. At the time, they made little sense. In hindsight, they looked like fragments of a much darker reality. Within the palace, loyalty acted as a barrier, shielding both reputation and behavior. A maid might witness something suspicious and remain silent. A footman might overhear a troubling conversation and say nothing out of fear. Senior officials, many with military backgrounds, believed that discipline meant obedience above all else. And towering above this structure was Andrew himself, protected by status, lineage, and the deep affection of the queen. Even in such a tightly controlled environment, however, the flaws were evident. He was often described as immature, entitled, and unwilling to take responsibility. His well-known insistence that staff arrange dozens of teddy bears in a precise order each day revealed a mind that had never truly matured. To many, he did not resemble a seasoned royal, but rather a man frozen in emotional adolescence. When such a mindset is paired with unlimited privilege, the consequences can be unsettling. Quietly, palace staff began to ask the same question among themselves. Who could ever restrain him? Discipline was weak, criticism was discouraged, and accountability was almost non-existent. Those who had served him longest became disillusioned, openly stating that he was the only royal who repeatedly caused serious trouble. Even his own siblings seemed perplexed by how often his behavior crossed the line, and how, time and again, he managed to avoid true consequences. The culture of silence that once lingered quietly within palace walls did not remain hidden forever. Over time, it seeped into the outside world, becoming especially noticeable as Andrew formed connections beyond England. Murmurs gradually turned into unease, private worries transformed into public scandals, and the prince could no longer shield himself behind the silent loyalty of staff who had long protected him, even from his own behavior. And if that revelation comes as a shock, it is only the beginning. Another staff member would later come forward with a confession that cast an even darker shadow. This was the moment Prince Andrew truly stood exposed. Charlotte Briggs once viewed service to the royal family as the greatest honor imaginable. In her mind, loyalty shaped character, kindness flowed naturally, and mutual respect guided every interaction. However, at just 21 years old, she stepped into a reality nothing had prepared her for. What she believed would be a refined and dignified role quickly became the kind of job no one desired. A placement within glittering palace walls where appearances sparkled, but behavior behind closed doors told a much different story. The Duke of York was nothing like the charming figure the public applauded. Behind the towering gates and pristine halls of Buckingham Palace, those closest to him knew a man who was abrupt, volatile, and shockingly entitled. Charlotte entered his world eager to serve with pride, but that enthusiasm was soon crushed by a temper capable of erupting over the smallest mistake. When she finally spoke out years later, she did so without hesitation or politeness. Her account was sharp, brutally honest, and shaped by memories she refused to bury any longer. She openly stated that she had no concern for Andrew's feelings. In her words, he was cruel and vile, a man who reduced her to tears countless times. As her story spread, the public glimpsed a version of the Duke known only to those who worked by his side. Not the smiling royal on the balcony, but an impossible-to-please figure who treated people as nothing more than props in his world. From the very beginning, Charlotte saw a man convinced the world existed to serve him. He barked orders for the simplest tasks, as though any small effort on his part would insult his sense of importance. Even something as insignificant as the curtains became a source of obsession. It wasn't about their color or material, but a tiny gap that she once left between them. So small it could barely be seen. Yet that minor imperfection was enough to trigger one of his infamous outbursts. He stormed out of his office, charged down the hallway and unleashed a furious stream of abuse at her, language unworthy of any royal title. His voice echoed through the corridors as staff froze in place, Charlotte in tears, and everyone silently reminded that in Andrew's world, perfection was still never enough. What stood out most, however, was not just his anger. It was the strange rules he enforced. His peculiar rituals bordered on the absurd, yet they were followed with military strictness. A personal collection of stuffed animals, 72 teddy bears, along with a hippo and a black panther, had to be arranged in exact order. Laminated diagrams detailed their precise positions, resembling tactical maps rather than instructions for toys. Charlotte was even trained in how to handle these items, as if she were preparing for a high-security operation instead of arranging plush animals on a bed. His bedroom followed the same rigid standards. Every pillow had to be aligned with perfect accuracy. Pajamas were placed carefully and evenly. The bears were displayed during the day, removed each night, and returned again at sunrise. Among the staff, quiet conversations questioned what kind of grown man required such routines just to feel at ease. For Charlotte, there was nothing amusing about it. Each day was filled with anxiety, like walking across shattered glass. One small error, one misaligned object, and his rage would once again explode. Other servants experienced the same treatment. Andrew's behavior followed a clear pattern: barking commands, asserting dominance, demanding admiration while offering no respect in return. Unlike his siblings, he bore no great burden of succession or overwhelming duty. He was not the future king, nor was he weighed down by extraordinary obligations. And yet, he behaved as though he ruled over subjects who lived in fear. Charlotte's experience spoke of far more than tantrums or stuffed animals. It revealed a man who seemed to enjoy tearing people apart, cultivating an environment so oppressive that even a palace felt like a prison. And in truth, that wasn't even the true beginning. There was something deeper in Andrew's nature that Charlotte, too, had come to understand. To truly make sense of it, one must look back to his early years. From the time he learned to walk, whispers filled the palace corridors. There was something unsettling about the young prince. Not playful, not curious, but disturbingly cold. While Charles immersed himself in learning and faced life's challenges with determination, Andrew drifted through the palace with the belief that everything already belonged to him. The staff noticed it first in the smallest gestures, the sharp demands for attention, the way he saw every room as his stage and every person as someone he could command, mock, or control depending on his mood. Even as a toddler, he seemed drawn to cruelty in a way other children were drawn to toys. Rather than shy away from the queen's guards, he strutted before them, twisting his face into mocking expressions, ridiculing their rigid posture. When they refused to react, bound by duty, his frustration only grew stronger. He pushed harder, determined to break their composure, driven not by playfulness, but by a hunger for control. If admiration was out of reach, domination would suffice. His temper did not stop with people. Animals also became victims of his frustration and boredom. He kicked the palace dogs if they were too slow and laughed at their pain. He struck horses' legs with sticks simply to see them flinch. Normally patient and silent, the grooms eventually reached their limit. One day, after he hit a horse yet again, they seized him and dunked him headfirst into a pile of manure. It was harsh, shocking, and unforgettable, but to them it felt like the only response he would understand. Still, even that moment was not the worst of his behavior. His bullying spread everywhere. His younger brother, Edward, became a regular target, facing shoves, slaps, stolen treats, and unexplained bruises. These were not playful sibling scuffles, but deliberate acts meant to dominate and humiliate. He needed to feel powerful over someone smaller and kinder than himself. The palace staff endured the same torment. One footman was mocked so relentlessly that he finally snapped, striking the young prince and leaving him with a black eye. Expecting to be dismissed, the man instead witnessed the queen's unexpected response. She refused to let him go. Even she seemed aware that Andrew had crossed a dangerous line, that his actions had gone far beyond childish misbehavior. School offered no reform. At prep school and later at Gordonstown, classmates didn't tease him out of jealousy, but out of fear and resentment. His tantrums, sneers, and cruel laughter made him notorious. Teachers described him as arrogant, spoiled, and impossible to control. As he grew older, the behavior intensified. Stories spread of him pulling at female staff members' clothing during events, smearing food on their faces and issuing obscene commands as though they were merely objects for his entertainment. On camping trips, he destroyed other children's shelters, hurled their belongings into rivers, and watched their distress with satisfaction. Those who worked closest to him summed it up with painful clarity. He was not raised to be a prince, he behaved more like a tiny tyrant. He threw things to the floor, shouted at staff, and replaced speech with orders. His entire world revolved around the belief that everyone else existed solely to serve him. And yet, disturbing as these stories are, they open the door to an even deeper question. When his early behavior is compared to the conduct of other men within the royal household, a stark contrast emerges. So what is it truly that sets Andrew apart from the rest of the working royals? Let's take a closer look at how his actions measured up against those of other members of the royal family, and explore why his conduct was considered significantly more troubling. As the comparison unfolds, the difference between Prince Andrew and his siblings becomes impossible to ignore. Inside the intricate environment of the British royal household, the ways in which staff are treated can vary dramatically. Former employees have repeatedly emphasized how distinct Andrew's behavior was, describing an attitude of entitlement and immaturity that made him especially challenging to serve. In contrast, other royals gained respect and loyalty through their fair and decent treatment of those around them, while Andrew's presence reportedly stirred unease and irritation. Prince Charles, for instance, was widely remembered by palace staff as being polite, calm, and considerate. He consistently acknowledged the efforts of those in his service, sometimes pausing to exchange a few words in passing or express his appreciation. Even when his expectations were high or his schedule demanding, his approach remained professional rather than belittling. As a result, staff often walked away from their duties feeling respected, not degraded. In an environment defined by rigid hierarchy, these kinds of gestures carried great weight, encouraging a culture of dignity and mutual regard from the very top. In the same way, Prince Edward built a reputation for being approachable and thoughtful. Those who worked for him recalled feeling relaxed in his presence and noted that he rarely issued unnecessary requests or behaved on impulse. Although he maintained standards befitting his position, he did not engage in the unpredictable late-night demands that Andrew was known for. While Andrew's attendants might be dragged from bed to walk a dog or handle bizarre errands in the middle of the night, those serving Edward could generally rely on a stable, fair, and realistic workload. These contrasts, subtle on the surface, pointed to deeper differences in both leadership style and personal integrity. Princess Anne, admired for her discipline and dedication to duty, similarly earned the respect of her staff. Her household was known for operating with precision and efficiency, yet she treated her employees as collaborators rather than disposable servants. Many former staff members described her as both professional and warm, someone who inspired commitment through competence and consistency rather than intimidation. Even amidst her demanding schedule, her sense of fairness allowed those around her to find confidence and pride in their work rather than fear or uncertainty. Andrew, by comparison, reportedly left his staff worn out, disheartened, and at times humiliated. Former maids and valets described his unreasonable and often juvenile demands, such as the notorious arrangement of teddy bears or being called upon at 2 a.m. for trivial matters, as an ongoing source of emotional strain. One former maid even stated that working for him was the only negative chapter of her palace career, saying he repeatedly destroyed the atmosphere in the household. Unlike his siblings and relatives, Andrew's behavior appeared to be fueled by a deep-rooted sense of entitlement formed by lifelong privilege. His position as a perceived favorite of the Queen, combined with a lack of firm boundaries in his upbringing, seemed to reinforce this mindset. These comparisons reveal that the palace itself was not necessarily a harsh or oppressive environment, as many royals managed to treat their staff with respect despite the strict hierarchy. Instead, it was Andrew's personal attitude and choices that produced such a uniquely difficult atmosphere. While loyalty and obedience were expected in palace life, fairness and human decency were still possible, as seen in the experiences of those who served other members of the family. Altogether, these differences provide insight not only into Andrew's character, but also into the broader inner workings of the royal household. Privilege does not have to conflict with responsibility, and authority can be balanced with compassion. However, when Andrew's conduct is placed beside the more considerate behavior of his relatives, it becomes clear that the true issue was not royal life itself, but the nature of the man in question. This brings us to a deeper and more troubling question. Beyond the experiences of staff within the palace, what else emerged as a result of his actions, and how far did this behavior truly extend? Reports concerning Prince Andrew eventually moved far beyond the palace grounds. In the beginning, the focus was on domestic staff such as maids, valets, and footmen who endured temper tantrums, endless demands, and degrading treatment. Over time, however, a far darker and more disturbing narrative came into view. Serious allegations of sexual misconduct and abuse surfaced, drawing international attention and revealing what many saw as a pattern of exploitation enabled by privilege, power, and the silence of those around him. At the center of these accusations was Virginia Giuffre, who publicly claimed that Andrew had abused her when she was underage. In her accounts, she described being pressured into sexual encounters with the prince, including meetings arranged in the homes of infamous associates. Although Andrew denied these claims, they resulted in legal action and relentless public scrutiny, highlighting once again how wealth, status, and elite connections can protect an individual from accountability for years. A clear link can be seen between these serious accusations and the earlier stories told by palace staff. In both situations, power combined with protection created an environment where misconduct could persist without challenge. Within the palace walls, staff were conditioned to comply and remain silent, knowing that questioning a senior royal could jeopardize both their careers and futures. Valets, maids, and security personnel were trained to follow orders, not to confront authority. Obedience was expected, and fear of retaliation ensured many kept their experiences to themselves. The same type of system that protected him in the palace also existed beyond it, allowing questionable behavior to continue without consequence. Even relatively small incidents, such as obsessively ordering the precise placement of his teddy bears, waking staff during the night, or ridiculing those who disappointed him, demonstrate a pattern of control and lack of empathy. On their own, these acts might seem insignificant, but when viewed alongside much more serious allegations, they reveal a consistent personality shaped by the belief that rules did not apply to him. His whims and desires routinely took priority over the well-being and dignity of others. The grand facade of royal life concealed a structure that not only upheld privilege, but also made it easier for harmful behavior to go unchallenged. Accounts from staff and public accusations together portray a man sheltered by rank who regularly exploited the space between power and accountability. Although the domestic incidents may not have crossed criminal boundaries, they serve as early warning signs of a mindset in which entitlement outweighed empathy and authority overshadowed morality. As these patterns extended beyond the palace and into elite circles, the consequences grew far more severe, with silence and influence concealing harm from public view. When placed together, staff testimonies and external allegations show that Andrew's behavior was not random, accidental, or misunderstood. Rather, it was shaped and protected by a culture rooted in unquestioning loyalty, fear, and institutional cover. Every unreasonable demand or humiliating act within the palace echoed the same imbalance of power that enabled more serious offenses beyond its gates. Within the royal household, loyalty is not simply encouraged. It is embedded into every aspect of daily life. For many staff members, service to the royal family defined their identity. Often beginning their roles as teenagers, they dedicated decades to serving the monarchy, with their work, financial stability, and sense of belonging all tied to the palace. The thought of speaking out, objecting, or leaving was terrifying because it meant losing not only a job, but a home, a community, and an entire way of life. In this world, loyalty became the invisible thread holding everything together. Those inside described an environment shaped equally by devotion and fear. Workers were carefully reminded of their place, existing to support the authority of the royals rather than to form equal relationships. Confronting inappropriate behavior or voicing dissatisfaction felt unthinkable. The unspoken expectation was simple: obey, tolerate, and protect the image of the household at all costs. Any form of defiance could lead to shame, removal, or even blacklisting. With financial dependence and limited alternatives, silence often felt like the only option. Adding to this pressure was the powerful layer of institutional protection. The palace's rigid hierarchy, long-established traditions, and fiercely loyal officials formed a protective wall around the royal family. From security to administration, many played a role in guarding the monarchy's reputation. This made exposing wrongdoing nearly impossible, and allowed problematic behavior to remain hidden for years. Stability and benefits, which initially attracted people to royal service, eventually became the same chains that kept them compliant. Over time, obedience evolved into a survival instinct. Staff members observed cruelty, manipulation, and entitlement every day, yet their voices remained trapped behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the royal household remained shielded from outside examination, maintaining its image while those within struggled in silence. Each act of compliance strengthened the system, ensuring that power stayed unchecked and privilege went unchallenged. Now that Prince Andrew's actions have been revealed to the public, it is worth asking whether other secrets still remain hidden behind the grand doors of the monarchy. What do you think lies beneath the surface? Share your thoughts, and remember to like and subscribe.